What's up, you guys? Matthew here. In this video, what I want to do is talk about a topic that I think is very interesting. We're going to talk about near-death experiences, and we're going to get deep into it. This is a topic that I believe has gone from very fringe. It was something that you wouldn't usually talk about, especially if it was something that happened to you. You would feel like people would think you're crazy if you talked about it, right? But no longer these days. It's coming out of the darkness, shown to the light, and a lot more people are accepting it as something that they can at least talk about, and more importantly, study as an intellectual, as someone with high credentials. If you're a medical doctor, if you're a PhD, if you can perform studies in these high settings of academia, you can now actually study this without being ridiculed by your peers. So let me show you quick some examples of how this has come from fringe to being more popular. Here we have an episode of Piers Morgan where they had a debate between one gentleman who studies near-death experiences and a skeptic, right? And Piers Morgan hosted that debate. It's a decent debate. It's kind of shallow. They only had 30 minutes to go, but nevertheless, this is one piece of evidence that these experiences are beginning to be more socially accepted. Another venue was Theo Vaughn. This one had 2.6 million views. He hosted Dr. Jeffrey Long, an expert on near-death experiences. Now, he is a medical doctor, right? So a lot of these experts in near-death experiences are actually people with high credentials in their field. We're talking PhDs in psychiatry. We're talking brain surgeons. We're talking medical doctors. So it's a pretty interesting thing to dig into if you are a person with kind of like an intellectual spin on things. I think you'll find a lot to chew on in this niche here. Another channel here is The Other Side NDE. This is where people share their NDE stories with this podcast here. They have 500,000 subscribers. Coming Home, another podcast where a bunch of people share their near-death experiences. 400,000 subscribers. And then Jeff Mara podcast has 255,000 subscribers. So what I'm showing here is basically that this topic and experiences like this have come out of the darkness and kind of been shown the light when it comes to the public eye. And I think that's pretty interesting. So first things first, let's describe what a near-death experience is. This is a term that was coined by Dr. Raymond Moody, and what it describes is basically a sequence of events that takes place when people have a close brush with death, right? They get crushed by a boulder, or they get in a car accident. One way or another, their heart stops or their brain stops getting any blood, right? And what happens in some cases is they have an out-of-body experience followed by a sequence of events that constitutes a near-death experience during the time when they shouldn't have been conscious. But then they regain consciousness as a body and they realize that they've had a near-death experience. Now, the first thing you might wonder is how often does this actually happen to people? And that's where science comes in. Here, we have a research paper by Dr. Bruce Grayson. He's one of the leading experts when it comes to studying near-death experiences. And they're basically wondering the incidence and correlates of near-death experiences in a cardiac care unit, basically how often it actually happens. And prior to the study, they had their previous notions when it came to how likely it was, and they thought it was about 2%. But since that time, studies using objective measures among unbiased samples of patients coming close to death suggest an incidence of between 9% and 18%. And in fact, also before this current research paper here, they had a Dutch study of 344 consecutively admitted cardiac patients that reported near-death experiences as often as 12%. The British study produced 11%, and an American study produced 23%, right? And so that was all prior to this research, and they wanted to do a better job at defining near-death experience. So they basically created a multiple choice test that Dr. Bruce Grayson defined as his method of classifying people as either having had a near-death experience or not. and basically using these 16 questions as an instrument to differentiate people who have had an experience from people who haven't had an experience was their method of defining in a more rigorous way than previous studies. Now, the conclusion here was that about 10% of people in this larger study had a near-death experience. Now, one interesting nuance about the finding in this paper is that they noticed there was a difference between the likelihood of having an NDE in people who had cardiac arrest compared to people who did not have cardiac arrest. This study is the first report documenting the decreased frequency of near-death experiences in patients without documented cardiac arrest, a finding that supports the association between these experiences and proximity to death. That's pretty interesting. And you might wonder why only 10%? That seems a little bit low. And the answer could be a bunch of different reasons, right? It could be that people just don't remember, or, they just didn't want to talk about it. Or it just never happened. And the reason it might not happen is because, they don't have a soul. No, I'm kidding. But, there could be many different reasons why basically you don't have one, or you don't remember, or you don't want to talk about it, basically. Anyways, another paper that I found interesting was this one on the temporality of features in near-death experience narratives. That's basically science talk for in what order do things happen when someone has a near-death experience? What are the sequence of events? And what they did was they collected 154 freely expressed written NDE narratives, and they used the Grayson score of about 7 out of the 32 questions. Originally, he had 16, I suppose. Then he expanded the multiple choice questions to 32. But in this study, they only used 7. So they're adopting his scale, but they think that only about 7 of these aspects that Grayson uses to define a near-death experience were relevant to this study. Now, what they found was that some of these near-death narratives consisted of a sequence of events that was basically an out-of-body experience, an experience of a tunnel, then they see a bright light and feel peace. Yet, this sequence was encountered in a very limited number of NDEs. Now, what this means is that basically the order of events is not so consistent between different narratives. And I can expand upon this a little bit later after we go through all of these research. But basically, they don't have a clear narrative that actually happens. They have one that's the most common, but even the most common sequence of events is rare, I suppose. One thing I'll say real quick is that if you were to watch these near-death experiences here on any of these podcasts that I showed you, where people share their experiences firsthand with you, you can obviously say that they're lying, but eventually after watching enough of them, you'll notice that there are consistencies. And one of them that's relevant to the study about the temporality, the order of events, is how people tend to describe the near-death experience as a timeless experience, right? And I actually had an interview with Dr. Raymond Moody a long time ago, before I even looked into this stuff. He had like a way you can basically schedule a call with him. And he was basically outlining for me the contradictory and paradoxical nature of a near-death experience, that people will often describe a near-death experience as both timeless, but then describe the narrative as a sequence of events, right, in some chronological order, when it's actually impossible for there to be some form of chronology in a timeless space, right? So what people kind of describe that as is more or less a real show, like a YouTube collection of experiences that they can more or less dial into in some form of timeless setting, right? So they can have multiple experiences at the same time, basically, and the mind can't unpack that in any meaningful way in order to describe it to somebody after the fact, other than to basically say this happened, then that happened. So That's what I have to say about that. Now, a really obvious thing for people to fixate on when it comes to this is basically they wonder if it's all in the brain, or if these experiences, no matter how consistent they are and how well studied they are in terms of the phenomenon itself, the subjective experience, they wonder if that experience is basically because of something biological, right? That it's just, nothing mystical. It's nothing spiritual. It's not proof of the soul. It's just proof of the brain, basically, and that we all have the same brain that causes the same thing. So one way that people approach that, kind of a string to pull on in order to get the whole sweater of the answer of whether or not it's in your brain or if it's some mystical thing, is do we have any cases of people experiencing consciousness or awareness during cardiac arrest? Now, mind you, this study right here, the AWARE study, is not a study about people who had NDEs. It's a study about people who had cardiac arrest. And what this study basically is about is people who were being resuscitated, getting CPR. That's like when you pump somebody's chest. And what they were mostly interested in finding out was the feasibility of actually testing the accuracy of the claims that people had when they were in cardiac arrest, claims of visual and auditory awareness. Like, I remember watching a couple of these NDEs on these channels, and people would say, I was floating above my body, but then I floated into the other room and saw that my dad was getting a Snickers bar. And I told him about that later, and it was actually accurate, right? Now, as a scientist, you want to be able to set up a test to actually verify that claim. And so this is basically getting into how do we go about that, and what's the feasibility of actually testing if somebody has a veridical perception during cardiac arrest or during resuscitation. So the outcomes that they decided to measure in this experiment were basically, one, the awareness or memories during cardiac arrest, or two, objective verification of claims of awareness using specific tests, right? So they settled on different versions of this, one being putting some numbers or letters above, where you can usually see, so that if you happen to float above your body, you can read those placards and then hopefully, for the sake of the experiment, tell people what the numbers were, which is very specific, but that's more or less one way you could go about objective verification of claims of awareness, right? You have to set it up yourself. And the results were that among 2,060 cardiac arrest events, 140 survivors completed interviews, while 101 of the 140 completed another interview. And 46% had memories, with 7 major cognitive themes being fear, animals, plants, bright light, violence, persecution, deja vu, family, recalling events, post-cardiac arrest. And mind you, these are not NDE experiences. These are just experiences during cardiac arrest, during resuscitation, that had these qualities, not necessarily people that had NDEs. This content is not content you find in an NDE. It's content you might find during or after a resuscitation of somebody who's having cardiac arrest. And it goes on that basically 9% had NDEs, while 2% described awareness with explicit recall of seeing and hearing actual events related to their resuscitation. 1 had a verifiable period of conscious awareness during which time, cerebral function was not expected. And the conclusion of the study was that cardiac arrest survivors commonly experience a broad range of cognitive themes, with 2% exhibiting full awareness. This supports other recent studies that have indicated consciousness may be present despite clinically undetectable consciousness. This, together with fearful experiences, may contribute to PTSD and other cognitive deficits post-cardiac arrest. And what I'll say about that is that a lot of people get PTSD post-cardiac arrest, but there are different metrics of the 9% that have the NDE. Now, before we move on, I want to make it very clear what actually happened in this awareness study, right? They said that 2% described awareness, but that they had one with a verifiable period of consciousness during a time when they shouldn't have any awareness, right? So that's, pretty amazing. But it was not done in the way where they set up the experiment with the placards, with the images or numbers on them. It's like they did not have a person float above their body and read the placard. The verifiable case was actually verified because they described accurately what was in the room at the time, not the placard. And the problem with that is that the placard is controlled by the scientists. They know that they put that up there in a controlled way where they know the answer and other people presumably don't know the answer. And so if somebody were to rise up their body and read the placard and accurately tell people what was on there, that's amazing. Whereas if somebody says what's in the room, or what's happening at that time when they're supposedly not supposed to have any consciousness, it could be other things, like they knew what was in the room or they heard about what happened and reset it. It's not as controlled. And another thing about this is that it's during CPR in many cases, right? CPR is when you're actually pumping blood to keep someone alive. So you're trying to pump blood into their brain. Sorry. And you would imagine that if you're pumping blood into somebody's brain, then, maybe there could be some capacity for brain activity. So that's where you have awareness 2. Now, awareness 2 is the second version of this same experiment, except this time they added a few different data points that they measure, specifically an EEG and cerebral oxygenation monitoring, right? So these are new data points that can tell you whether or not there is brain activity or oxygenation flowing through the system, right? Which would be markers for potential of awareness, right? Or at least if that's what's happening, then you could measure whether or not it is correlated with these different, ways of monitoring, right? And the result of the experiment was that of the 560 in-house cardiac arrest patients, 53, so that's like 9.3% survived. 28 of them, about 52.8%, completed interviews, and only 11, which is like 39.3%, reported cardiac arrest memories and perception, suggestive of consciousness. On top of that, they also had about 4 or 5 different forms of experience emerge from this experiment. Basically, people who would wake up during CPR or people who would wake up post-resuscitation, people who had dreamlike experiences, and then people who had a transcendent near-death experience-like experience. I don't think they defined it necessarily here. It's not like they're using the Bruce Grayson, multiple questions here, I don't think. So they just called it transcendent recalled experience of death, and RED, right? So that's different than an NDE, I suppose. They also had that 5th type of experience, which was basically just delusions, people who remembered incorrectly or just verifiably misinterpreted something. And the low survival limited the ability to examine for implicit learning. Nobody identified the visual image, right? So that's the placard we were talking about. So still in awareness 2, nobody identified the placard, but they did have one person, 1 out of the 28, 3.5%, identified the auditory stimulus. And so the conclusion of this study, Awareness 2, was that consciousness, awareness, and cognitive processes may occur during cardiac arrest. The emergence of normal EEG may reflect a resumption of a network level of cognitive activity and a biomarker of consciousness, lucidity, and RED, authentic near-death experiences. So it is kind of the same. Now, let's kind of handle some of the objections here. Obviously, that sample size is trash. Same with awareness. Both of these, Aware 1 and Aware 2, have pretty low sample sizes that they yield from all of these patients, mostly due to the fact that there are a limited number of survivors and then a limited number of people who actually complete the interviews. So it's kind of problematic that you can't get enough volume to kind of get a big sample size here. And Aware 2 is actually even worse, even though they beefed up the, actual experiment with new forms of measurement, they got way worse sample size, right? So it's kind of bad in that respect. But a lot of people would also say that the EEG stuff kind of points to the fact that, they had brain activity. So isn't that a counterpoint? Doesn't that mostly say that the reason why they had these awareness conscious experiences is because they actually had brain activity, right? But the problem with that is there wasn't really a direct correlation between people who claim to have aware and conscious experiences and people who had the positive EEG readings and, sufficient oxygenation levels. If it were a direct correlation, then obviously you would just conclude that this is due to the brain. But, one camp might say, yeah, you have some positive readings. That's proof that you can get activity. But the other camp would say there's no correlation there, so it's not very relevant. So to recap here, we have basically a limited sample size in Aware 1, and Aware 2 has an even worse sample size. And then we also have kind of confusing results when it comes to the EEG and oxygenation not really being correlated with people claiming they have conscious experiences. And then of the objectively verified awareness experiences, we have one person that claimed they saw and accurately described what was in the room and happening at the time when they weren't supposed to, and another person that verified the auditory cue in the Aware 2 experiment, right? Now, still, I'd say we have another problem that people often bring up, and it's pretty much not just the fact that, there's brain activity, which we kind of took care of in Aware 2, but the timing issue, the issue of timing the experiences. Because if you're going to ask somebody in an interview after they wake up from, being resuscitated, what happened, and they say, okay, this happened, then that happened, and I had a near-death experience. It's very difficult to attribute that experience to a time when it happened, meaning that you don't know via this experiment or the prior experiments whether or not that experience happened actually during the no brain activity or during a time when they shouldn't be able to, or if it was just recalled and unpacked by the brain as it was coming back online or going offline, meaning that you can't time it. There's a timing issue there still. Now, the timing issue here is actually important because it comes into play in some of the most controversial cases where somebody says they had basically an out-of-body experience, or more specifically, they heard some sort of auditory noise, or they had some sort of visual perception during a time when they shouldn't have been able to have any such experiences. So in the case of Pam Reynolds, we have a paper here by someone who's a skeptic. This is Gerald M. Worley, writing a paper in response to Pam Reynolds, who was put under general anesthetic, had a flat EEG reading. Her body was all the way cooled down, put under general anesthetic for the sake of surgery. And yet she claims that she saw the shape of the bone saw. She saw the saw. And then she also heard the lyrics of Hotel California. And ultimately what it boils down to is, when did those lyrics play? And when did she see the bone saw? And ultimately, the skeptic argues that the timing issue comes into effect, that it basically happened when it was entirely possible that she could have perceived such things. And the reason that this case is important is because it highlights why science is important to study this under controlled scenarios. I could read this long paper, but it all boils down to him just trying to debunk it because of the timing issue, right? So, it is what it is, but that's why we need more aware studies, right? Because he's not disproving that NDEs are some sort of mystical transcendent thing. He's just saying that the Pam Reynolds case is insufficient to claim that it is such a thing, right? And it's something, the Pam Reynolds situation is something that's revered by proponents of NDEs. But, I think that it's insufficient because a lot of the timing is supplied by more or less hearsay. You're trying to ask the doctors, when did that lyric play, right? And you're trying to go back into the records. and it's just not airtight, right? You don't know. It's kind of hearsay. A doctor said it was playing at this time, right? And the time he said it was kind of, as the surgery was ending, and when the skeptic says that it was entirely possible for her to have some sort of perception. All's to say, I personally don't put too much weight on the curious case of Pam Reynolds, because to me, it more or less just highlights why we need to have more strict scientific methods, because obviously the skeptics are going to want more compelling arguments that are more controlled, that aren't hearsay. And so they are planning more studies. We have Aware 3 kind of being drafted. They're in pilot studies, kind of like, preemptive stuff. But what I hope is basically that they start to think in terms of broadening the visual cues, because it's kind of difficult. I think one of the main things with the Aware thing is like the reason why a lot of people don't see the numbers or the images on the placards above them when they rise above their body is, you're not really told that they're up there. You're not really trying to like help with science as you're dying. It's like, when most people talk about why they didn't see the placards or the images or hear the sound, it's because they basically were focused on stuff like, Jesus showing up or there being a big portal to another dimension. It's like, are you really going to stop and read a number on a card and remember it when all this other stuff is happening? It's, it's a little bit, problematic in that case. So they're trying to broaden the visual aspects, broaden the auditory aspects of the experiment, and they're trying to fix the timing issue with kind of better structure, right? But it's really hard because if it's experimental science, you'd have to basically induce these near-death experiences, which is unethical. It's just problematic all around. So it's a very slow process of basically observational science, where it's something akin to psychology or studying the evolutionary timeline, where you're not really inducing people into psychotic states in order to study that. You're more or less relying on their subjective phenomenological input to get their medications right. And you're kind of just tossing medications at them and seeing how it works, because you get a certain percentage that behave predictably to this treatment and they show improvement in their life. And so it's kind of like psychology in that aspect, but also it's kind of like studying evolutionary biology when you're looking at the timeline. You can't really run back and do experimental science on the theory of evolution. You kind of just have to use observational science to put the pieces together. And this kind of, field where you're studying near-death experiences or the, feasibility of how to run an experiment about that, or see if consciousness can live without the body, all of that is kind of relegated into observational science when you think about it in terms of studying somebody's subjective phenomenological experience, right? Now, I don't want to make this video too long, but there's a little bit more here to be said about this topic in general, especially when it comes to kind of analyzing how true it is that the body can die and your consciousness survives, right? One of the things is basically that a lot of these experiences kind of match experiences on psychedelics. Like, let's say you have an experience on DMT, and then that experience kind of matches a lot of these near-death experiences. You might wonder, is that even furthermore evidence that this is a biological thing, right? If we have some sort of compound that can be metabolized by your system and results in a psychedelic experience leveraging your biology, you might wonder if that is what's happening, as a near-death experience. It's basically just a biological, natural DMT trip. And as usual with anything people are interested with, they did a study on this exact topic here. Here we have a comparison between naturalistic DMT experiences and the near-death experience. I'll just read the results so we don't drag this on here. It says, the canonical NDE themes identified across the DMT experiences include translocation, bright lights, sense of dying, the void, disembodiment, tunnel-like structures, light being-esque entities, deceased family, life review-like and hyper-empathetic experiences, and a total of 95% of participants reported at least one of these. 12 less typical NDE motifs were also noted, 5 classical NDE features were entirely absent from DMT, while DMT exhibited an even broader array of experience features that were absent from NDEs. So DMT clearly shares a more basic phenomenological structure with NDEs, but shows differences in the prevalence of certain features. Furthermore, DMT did not present any immediately recognizable linear sequencing of themes. Overall, DMT is distinctly unique in its qualitative content, characterized by its more prodigious and stereotypical nature, which includes kaleidoscopic, extraterrestrial, transcultural, fluctuating, and even overwhelming elements. And I'll personally add to that there are other aspects of NDEs, such as 70 to 85% reduction in death anxiety and other well-documented psychological changes that happen to people who have NDEs, but don't happen to people who take DMT, right? So there's a lot of differences there. I think enough to say that they are distinct phenomenon. But all things considered, I think what's more interesting is kind of getting to the bottom of, can consciousness survive the body, basically. And so you might ask, Matt, what do you think of all this? What do you make of it? What's your conclusion, right? And as a skeptic, somewhat agnostic, I suspend my belief in line with the science being inconclusive, but I definitely have my preferences. I would obviously prefer that life have more possibilities, that there be some form of infinite progression in which we can, basically have the opportunity to have a good time forever. That would be a lot better than some sort of limited window in which we can have a fun time, but there's also adversity and stuff like that. It's, less optimal than more possibilities. And I think we would all kind of agree with that, or at least most of us. I don't know what your preference is with regard to that, but other than preferences, what I'll say is that if you were to watch a lot of these, it's not scientific. You're just, more or less watching people's anecdotal takes on their own experience. It's kind of hearsay. But if you were to take that hearsay seriously and more or less trust what these people have to say, you would eventually get to a point where you see that a lot of them corroborate what each other says about the experience. They have similar experiences that, they're not captured by science in a controlled way, but eventually you have enough of it where you start to form a narrative and you start to think, well, okay, these people might not be in a controlled setting, but enough of them are saying that they rose up out of their body, visited another town, told their mother or brother, whoever it was, what they were doing on that day at that time, and it turned out to be true, right? And enough of that happens, you start to think, okay, well, maybe that wasn't captured by science, but eventually science will catch up. Like, somebody's going to read the placard, right? Someone's going to describe the number that they put up there for someone to see when they rise up out of their body. A skeptic might say, well, okay, that might be the case, but not one soul has ever read the number yet in the experience. And you might counter again and say, like, well, people aren't looking to read a number and help you run a science experiment while they're dying, right? So in all reality, like strictly speaking, there's not enough scientific evidence, but I think there's enough hearsay, but hearsay is not that scientific or reliable. But if you just trust people, which I don't know if you trust people or not, or specifically these people that are sharing the experience, you would get maybe enough for you to consider that perhaps it's true. And that's kind of where I'm at. That's kind of like, if I'm being honest with myself, it's entirely possible that all these people kind of had some experience, and the timing issue makes it so that it's kind of brain generated still. But I can't help but think that maybe what they're saying is true. And there's a lot more to it. It's not just talking about seeing other people remotely. It's also different metaphysical things, right? So we can get into that a little bit. It kind of helps solidify the argument, but keep in mind, this is hearsay. What mostly gets me with the more hearsay anecdotal stuff is things like when you're watching them and you're looking at these different NDE experiences, what I look for are the extremely rare but specific, highly specific, the more specific, the better, perceptions that people have within the experience. So one of those is 360 vision. But on top of 360 degree vision, there's this multiple perspective, like think of bilocating, trilocating, being omnipresent in every location, but in every location while having a 360-degree view. That seems like a very specific, highly detailed experience to describe. And yet enough of these people describe that exact specific perception. And that's so cool to me. And I can try and list as many highly specific, unlikely in my opinion to be made up due to its specificity, and at the same time being corroborated by others, you begin to trust a little bit more that maybe they're all talking about the same thing. 360-degree vision, that's a pretty, detailed and specific thing to say. For another person to say that to me is important, just a little bit, right? If enough people tell you that they never forget the NDE, that they remember it more than anything else in their life, and enough people tell you that, you start to think that they're not making it up. If enough people tell you that their NDE seemed more real than reality itself, than their waking life, that for some reason they felt like where they went was home, that they had some sort of experience in communion with the universe in itself enough to garner all of the hidden intelligence in the world, that they remembered everything that they were taught, everything that they learned, quantum mechanics and things like that. But then they forgot it as soon as they came back. And that's kind of the shared experience that people have. It's interesting that people share that experience. And you could always, don't get me wrong, you could always say that that's just in the head, yes, but they still nevertheless share those experiences. So I wouldn't doubt that they share the experiences, but the specificity of it kind of points to it, these people at least saying something real, but maybe even at the end of the day, you can say that the timing problem makes it impossible as a viewer of any of these to determine if they actually experience that. In the case of remote viewing, right, you could say that it's not proof of life after death, it's proof of remote viewing perhaps in life, right? So it's so many counter arguments. I'm not completely sold, but I think it's so cool to look into these and just see what the corroborative narratives are. So this is the last thing that I'm going to add. And basically what it is it's something called an SDE, a shared death experience. And what that means is that there are stories, they're kind of corroborated in this anecdotal sense where you have somebody who has a near-death experience, and in that near-death experience, they receive information that is about another person's death, and then they find out that that person died, right? One of them was a guy who got into a car accident, and pretty much what happened is him and his wife basically had an out-of-body experience together. He said, I don't want you to die, or it's all my fault. And she said, okay, you have to stay and I'm going to leave. And then he goes back into his body and it's, I guess, confirmed that she's dead. So the narrative that played out in the NDE was corroborated in reality. But you could say in that instance, it's like, him just kind of playing out a narrative for what he maybe intuitively understood upon waking up, and it's this coping thing. But there are different ones that are kind of more remote, where somebody has an NDE and then his buddy who's very far away commits suicide, and he knows that this guy committed suicide because during the NDE he saw him in transition and was like, what are you doing here? And he's like, tell him I'm sorry or something like that. And there's cases like that, like let's say you're in hospice and you're kind of like seeing people through a transition. There are cases where you kind of experience more or less what they experience as an NDE, but you yourself are not dying. You're just kind of sharing the experience with them. So there's these different angles in these different forms of shared death experiences that I think are of like a different form of evidence. They haven't really studied that in a scientific way, but I think it is probably one of the more compelling arguments for life after death, or at least remote gathering of information during an NDE. So it's still questionable, but it allows people to kind of think about it a little bit more when you're thinking, okay, these people are sharing a death experience. So that about wraps it up. There are many more metaphysical and narratives about the afterlife that are corroborated by all these people. It's kind of fun to think about if somebody has the same narrative and they're like, what happens in the afterlife is this and that. And you're like, oh, wow, that's kind of cool. That to me is the most interesting part, but it's maybe for another video. And what I'll leave you guys with is that we'll explore more things like this in detail on this channel with the specificity that I just did in this video. So if that's something you're into, go ahead and hit subscribe, go ahead, share the video with someone you think would find this all interesting, and I'll see you guys in the next video.